This is a truly astonishing place. There are a lot of negative stories that are told about South Africa and its history, because its history is a human history, and all human history is a checkered history. It's got a world-famous wine trade. It's got an incredible agricultural industry. It's got conservation success story after conservation success story. It's brought animals like the white rhino back from near extinction. And this is a country whose future is not clear, and it's not stable, and it's not certain. There continue to be racial tensions in the country, and great poverty and political corruption, and this is why repeatedly a negative story is told about the country. One often feels like the story that's told about South Africa is that the story of Europeans coming here and their descendants who settled here, you know, this is just a story of a malignant presence, but that's not really true. And as I said, it's internationally famous wine trade, its incredible landscape, its farming industry, its conservationism, all of these things are, at least in part, bound up with the history of Europeans coming here, settling here. And I think it's important to remember that this naive narrative that is often said, that people who are the descendants of Europeans are not naturalized, they're foreigners to this land. And the black African population are the true people of South Africa. But, you know, that's a very superficial understanding of the history of this country, which is far more complex. Right now, we are driving for hours into the night to get into the heart of the Great Karoo, which is right in the middle of South Africa. It's the most naturally hostile environment that you can come across. Incredibly difficult to farm, rich with wildlife, and there lives someone I've got to know recently, William, and we're going to go meet him and learn about the wonderful work that people are doing in that area.
You're quite right, they don't focus on all the positive stories of settlement here. Barnard, open heart surgery, first man to do a bypass. In every walk of life you can point to guys who are of settler stock here who have really achieved something and contributed.
I used to find it really interesting that colleagues of mine would have very, very strong opinions on South Africa and how things have gone wrong, and in some ways they were correct, but missing out so many things that have been a success or speak to its success, its progress.
The key giveaway in these hills is not what you see, it's what you hear.
Right.
And these kudu have got, as you know, large ears.
Yeah.
So we must always be aware they are so alert, particularly at this time of the morning when they are at the most vulnerable. They're coming out of a night's feeding in the river bush, and they're now exposed up on the high ground in the open. So we must remember that. Kudu are normally seen because of their ears. They've got these large pink ears, just remember that, keep an eye out for it. You'll notice they've also got stripes, normally between 4 and 12, somewhere around that. The animals that we're looking for today are the old bulls. And very often you'll hardly see a stripe because they've faded. They're now on the wane and their pelts are now going very grey. Okay. So it may be that we don't see stripes on them, which is a good thing. It's a key indicator when you look at them. We won't be more than, I think, 150 yards for any shot, sometimes as close as 30 to 40.
Right,
See how we go.
Yep.
Do you want to have a quick look through the binos, check, just feel for how they work? Should we have a look? Okay, you went for the top one?
Yeah.
You're dead on.
Yeah.
You're dead on. Do you want to have a look through there? You're just at the bottom, exactly where you want to be. You're just about a centimetre right.
Where I aimed.
There you go. Okay, I'm happy with that.
Looking.
Kudu are really unpredictable. If we get an opportunity early, we will take it. But it's the right animal, because you could find you go next 4 days and you don't get an opportunity.
Sure.
So we are going to do a lot of walking. We're going to work hard for whatever animals we shoot. It's just a question of, if we get the right kudu, we mustn't be shy. We must just focus very quickly.
Is that electric?
No. Just always hold it. That is. This is the top one, sorry. Okay.
That is quite electric.
Here, come here.
William, how did you end up here?
Well, I met my wife. I've been so fortunate. Yeah, we met in London, and I was still soldiering, and her parents had bought this farm a few years earlier, and we started coming out on holiday once a year, and then it became twice a year, and we both got jobs in the city, and we were gainfully employed, very happy, but we started asking ourselves, is there not something more? Could we not be more satisfied? And I think as a soldier I was looking for a few more thrills again. I think I was driving a desk, and my mother-in-law said, if you want, there's a life here for you, but you're going to have to think about what you're going to do with it. You can't just come out here on a whim. So we had a good think, and I'd done a master's at Reading in land management just after I left the army, and I realised that tourism was the thing. So if we could combine tourism with sustainable farming and sustainable game management, there could be a really meaningful life for us. I think it was a heck of a risk. I think people probably thought we were stark crazy, but it's paid off.
Was it not a culture shock for you to move from inner city London life to this?
No, I think that South Africa feels very homely, and this has so much in common with the old country that I never really felt I was abroad. And I think with communications,
This doesn't look a lot like England to me.
it doesn't today anyway. But you know, with communications, you don't feel you're far away at all.
Right.
There's no time zone difference. I've had to learn that I'm not running soldiers anymore. I'm running staff with their own challenges. They've never had it easy. You've seen the poverty that exists here. So I've had to learn to cut them some slack at times and roll with the punches, and accept that things don't happen as quickly as one would want. Don't run to a time schedule, I've learned.
I understand that you cater to tourists and you show people this landscape and you take them on sporting adventures.
Yeah.
But as you said, you are also a farmer, and you are employing this method of regenerative farming, and you are I suppose what I'm getting at here is that there's an awful lot of talk about environmentalism, green policies, all of this sort of stuff. But you're not simply talking about it. Yeah. You are an on-the-ground conservationist.
That's right. Somehow I've found myself in that role, and I'm delighted that I have. I suppose my idea of sustainability 10 years ago would have been taking my own plastic bag to Sainsbury's.
Yeah.
Recycling. But yeah, I found myself in a position where we can really make a difference. And it's a movement that's spreading remarkably quickly, particularly in the United States, where they've got, I think, 60 harvests left, they think. The soil is in real real dire straits there. I know you've read on that. Therefore, I can actively make a difference. I couldn't, if I had a 9 to 5 job back in the UK, actively impact the soil and the landscape around me. So I'm very lucky.
So are you quite positive about the future of South Africa? I mean, not just from conservation perspectives, but the story that's told about South Africa outside the country is often one of overhunting, over-farming, political instability, unfortunate ongoing racial tensions. You seem to have a very positive vision for the country and see a bright future.
Yeah, I think first of all, positive news stories aren't exciting. They don't make an impact, it seems to me. They're quite niche, the kind of thing you might find on Facebook or Instagram if you follow the right pages that sort of appeal to your identity. So there's a lot of good going on here. There are huge headwinds, of course, and they've been very well publicised over the last few years. A population that yearns for work, yearns for education, and for one reason or another, those needs have not been satisfied. Yeah. And therefore you have a disillusioned population. And that's very difficult, and that's across the board. I've spent my life trying to talk people out of leaving. They say they're thinking of packing it all in, and I remind them, well, what is the alternative? Is it a Barratt home outside London when you've had 7,000 acres? Is that what you're going to swap this for? The potential of the country, well, it's why that people fought over this country, for good or for ill.
You have conveyed to me your understanding of hunting and sportsmanship, which I think is one that is not that belongs to the popular mind. Your approach to hunting is tightly bound with your view of conservation responsibilities.
I think that in this rushed modern world, everything is sort of commoditized. Everyone's time is precious. And unfortunately, the people who come here generally to hunt are busy, intelligent people. They've thought about what they're going to do, and they come and by and large do it very well, but they haven't got much time on their hands. These are the days of 3 or 4 week safaris are long gone. They're here for a week. And unfortunately for them, they're on a time schedule. What I'm trying to do is to do things very differently. This is to shoot 2, maybe 3 animals in a week. And the hunter will have covered 30 to 40 kilometers in that week. They will have prepared themselves physically and mentally for the undertaking, but they will still find that it's a heck of a challenge. But they will also find that they will spend hours observing the wildlife, totally undisturbed. They'll be involved in the decision-making process, and they'll understand why that process is being undertaken and why a certain animal is selected, and then they will stalk it very, very carefully. And I believe that far greater than having a set of horns on the wall at home, they will then go back better able to convey to a largely sceptical audience why they do what they do. And I don't believe a photograph of a grinning hunter high-fiving in videos, or indeed a set of horns necessarily on a wall for all to see, achieves that aim. I really think it's a deeply personal experience, and you've got to find a way to convey it to others in a way that they understand. But of course, it's very, very different. It's very hard to convey it from a photograph about how you felt that moment when you squeezed that trigger. Yeah. And you'd spent all night worrying that when it came to that moment, you wouldn't do it. It's a difficult.
Yeah. Derek Light, you are an attorney, a lawyer here, but you also give a lot of advice to local government. How do you see the political landscape at the moment and where South Africa is going?
We, in very interesting times, Sebastian, it's sort of a watershed election we've just had. We no longer have a very strong ANC that they used to have a majority, a clear majority. That landscape has changed.
South Africa is often considered outside of the country as a country that is tormented by ongoing corruption at the level of ministers and parliamentarians. Do you see that changing now? And do you see the rule of law being adhered to much more seriously?
Yeah, one would certainly hope so, and I think there is a sense of positivity, optimism, that things are going to change. The level of corruption has become unacceptable to everybody, and everybody feels very strongly about that. With coalition government, there will be checks and balances, and that will be seriously addressed. There are signs that government are doing that. Apart from the obvious negative impact it has on our people directly, it also impacts on your ability to do business worldwide, and to attract investment and so on. So I think it's essential, and I think it will happen, yeah.
South Africa has for quite some time now, I think since the time of Mandela, has had its version of what Americans would call affirmative action, a preference for black applicants or so-called coloured applicants over anyone from European descent for any senior positions, political, university, whatever. And I've heard a number of people say their real concern about this is, one, it doesn't really make sense historically. An argument could be made that, say, the presence of Afrikaners in this country predates the presence of Zulus in this country. So it doesn't really make sense historically. But also that one of the practical consequences of this is that people are being placed in positions of huge responsibility who aren't really competent and they don't really have the credentials, but they're being chosen over others who could be a much better fit for these positions purely on grounds of skin pigment or DNA, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Or it's not good for the prosperity of the whole country, and everyone suffers as a consequence. Is that a fair assessment of what has happened? Or do you think that's a bit harsh?
I think it's a bit harsh.
Okay.
We have a complex history. We've got a history of colonialism, Dutch, British, and there were atrocities committed in those times.
Of course.
And then followed by the apartheid government, where further atrocities were committed. The country, on the face of it, flourished under apartheid. The Afrikaner government, they were efficient people. We became independent in a number of ways. We produced our own steel. We had a successful electricity supply company that was going to supply electricity to Africa, basically. Roads were built, tunnels were built, dams were built, banks were established, and it flourished. It impacted largely positively on the white population and marginalized black people in levels, at all levels, education, housing, at every level. And our parliamentary system was built on the British sort of model, but participation in that in government was limited to white people. When we then went into a constitutional democracy, where we have a Bill of Rights and so on, our political, not only our political landscape changed, but the legal landscape changed. And there was an acceptance that we had to redress the wrongs of the past. And in doing that, you had to revise education systems, you had to do all sorts of things. There's also this massive inequality which rose, I suppose it's not only in South Africa that you have inequality between the rich and the poor, the gap. But it had been designed that way in a way because black people didn't have the same opportunities as white people. A mechanism had to be found to try and close that gap and to give opportunity to people that previously were disadvantaged in many ways. So BEE and affirmative action was born of those considerations. But I can tell you this, that in the mid-70s, there was no unemployment virtually. Everyone had a job, black, white, colored. Everyone had a house. They were just segregated, and the non-white groups were largely confined to doing lesser. They didn't get into management and things like that. So, but the economy, in a sense, was in a far better space. By mid-1980, we had zero inflation. Our rand was 2 rand to the pound, and $1.43 bought you a rand, American dollar. So we had a stable economy, despite the fact that we were embargoed by most countries because of apartheid. So we had a stable economy, everyone had work, everyone had houses, and everything worked.
It sounds like you've moved from
efficiency to
sort of a less just arrangement with greater prosperity to a more just arrangement with
less prosperity.
With less prosperity.
Yes, and it's a major challenge. To get that balance right. From a moral perspective, the motivation was sound. I think in its implementation, it's gone wrong. And we are 30 years into our democracy. We've got to get over ourselves. You know, we've got to stop thinking of ourselves as white, black, or coloured.
And do you see people revisiting that conversation now and saying, okay, if the intention was good but the implementation has been poor, let's have a different approach to this now?
Yeah, I think
that conversation being had?
I think it comes up regularly, and I think it has to be had. And the academics must look at it, and we must all look at ourselves, you know, in our own policies, with your own business, you know, the sustainability of what we are doing. But we carry baggage, and it irritates people sometimes because they don't feel responsible for it, if you know what I mean. If Cecil John Rhodes and his team of people under British colonialism committed atrocities, why should I, as an English-speaking South African of settler descent, be paying a price for what they did then? You know, so there comes a time when you've got to move on. You know, your history is what makes your country what it is. But we can't, you know, for how long must Germany, for example, be ostracized for what they did to the Jewish people under Adolf Hitler, for example? And there's a time where you've got to you must acknowledge your history, but you must move on, and as a people, you know.
Do you see in South Africa today people seeing themselves less as Xhosa, less as Afrikaans, less as English descent, but just as South Africans?
No and yes.
Okay.
No, and that's a good thing.
Yeah.
You'll find the Afrikaner people, for example, feel very strongly about their heritage. You know, they're religious people, their language, their culture is important to them. You find it also amongst the black people, very strong, you know, traditional values, ceremonies, and they're proud of their culture, and they should be. And it'll differ from the Xhosa to the Zulu and the Matabele and the various population groups. And you'll find that the colored people, for example, they have very strong heritage, particularly in the Western Cape, but they also have strong cultural values, and it's a good thing.
I should explain for our viewers that coloured in South Africa means something very different to what it means, say, in America. It's not, it's not a racial slur.
Yes. No.
It's a unique ethnic identifiable group.
Yeah, and incredible history as well, you know. You had the Khoi people and the San people that were the original indigenous people of this area, for example.
Bush people, as they were called.
Yes. A lot of people refer to the Khoi San, but they were actually different groups and but they were the original South Africans. Yeah. If anyone was indigenous to this area, it was them.
Yeah.
But then you had slavery, you know, so you had Malay people and you had people from, you know, like from different parts of the world that became intertwined, and with the whites crossing the barriers, if you like, you had a whole new population group developed since about, say, the mid-1600s or so. They have a very strong culture and an interesting ethnic group within our country. And I think it's good that you have and you retain your roots and your cultural, there's nothing wrong with it being different in that sense. The English-speaking white population have also become integrated in the sense that my mom was, for example, she was Afrikaner and my dad was very English, with a sort of 1820 settler background. You had the French Huguenots and you had Dutch people and you had British people. My wife's family's got a strong Irish connection, but also a strong French Huguenot connection. So you had all these people that immigrated from Europe coming to Africa and establishing themselves here. And then you have this, over time, the integration of these various population groups. And they all have a strong sense of identity, but some of them have morphed. For example, my background and my wife's background is like a mixture of Irish and Scottish and French Huguenot and Afrikaner and English. So I consider myself very strongly to be a South African with roots elsewhere, and we acknowledge that, but we're predominantly South African. And I think that the majority of South Africans consider themselves to be South Africans first, but that doesn't mean they have to abandon their heritage and their strong cultural links to their forefathers and things.
And one would hope it also doesn't mean that they have to look with disdain on the other groups with which they share the country.
Absolutely not. And we've got to respect and one does your differences. The fact that you don't have to apologize for this fact that you're different. And one must respect those differences and respect the cultures and the language and the heritage, basically.
So you're very hopeful about the future of the country, it seems.
I'm very confident, positive. Yeah, no, we've got fantastic people. The majority of people in this country are good people.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for meeting with me. In the UK, farming and conservation are often seen to be principles that are in opposition to one another, and farming increasingly has a reputation of habitat destruction and problems with topsoil and all of that sort of thing. And in the popular arena, the rewilders and the farming community are struggling to come to terms. Something very different is going on in South Africa. That agriculture, farming, and care for a wild landscape are coalescing and supporting one another. And this is your work.
Yeah. So I suppose to start off with, we are experiencing the same that you guys are experiencing with regards to agriculture and conservation. Definitely very separate topics. They've, you know, even in the universities, they've been very separate topics. And there hasn't really been this kind of coalition between the two. And so, yeah, so that's what we're doing in the Karoo. I suppose to give you guys a bit of history, firstly about South Africa and the Karoo, where we are. Historically, we would have had these migrations of springbuck coming through the Karoo, and then they would kind of go into the Kalahari. And we unfortunately don't know much about these migrations. The last migrations was in about 1896. But there's some very interesting descriptions and stories about how these springbuck came in their millions through the Karoo, and then would kind of just eat whatever they could, run through whatever they could, and move on. And I was reading some stories where they, in Beaufort West, which is a town just kind of west from here, these springbuck would come through and would spend 3 days in this town, in your gardens, in the roads. You couldn't go out of your house because you could get trampled. Wow. And so we had historically these massive migrations coming through. It wasn't an annual migration, but it was definitely every couple of years. And we unfortunately don't know the path of these migrations, because at that stage we had a lot of these trekboere, these farmers moving into South Africa, moving northwards to go and find better land for their farming. And so we didn't really have the guys writing down a lot of the information.
We get a feel for it from rock art, though.
Yes.
You will find rock art in places where these animals would have moved in great number, because in order for the artist to portray this, he would have needed a great deal of time. So it stands to reason he was looking at a lot of animals crossing that piece of ground for a long time.
So if you've got millions of springbuck on these migration trails coming through perhaps every 3 years, and they're stripping the whole landscape, eating everything, but simultaneously they're grinding up the soil with their hoofs, and they're manuring compost into the ground. And this had a serious effect for what the landscape looked like. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's exactly what we're looking at. So these migrations stopped, and obviously that would have had a massive impact on the ecosystems. And then a couple of years later, in the 1950s, 1960s, we had a wool boom in the Karoo, or in the world, and the farmers were putting a lot of wool sheep onto their lands, way above their carrying capacity. And so over the years we had this deterioration in the landscape, and a lot of this deterioration we can still see today. So
you can see it here.
Yeah.
So the Karoo
this is years
does not look as healthy as it once did, essentially.
Yeah, and there's actually some stories about how these trekboere, or explorers, were riding their horses just north of Graaff-Reinet, so just across the plains from where we are, and they were riding on their horses, and the grass was coming up to their knees, and so it would have looked a lot different. They would have definitely experienced the droughts that we still experience today. Would have definitely looked a lot different because of these migrations.
So what you're suggesting is that farmers, rather than trying to sort of continue to dominate the landscape and perpetuate much of the farming that has historically taken place here, that you sort of sit at the feet of natural processes and try to imitate them in your farming methods. Exactly. Have I got that right?
Exactly. And that's where We are looking at regenerative agriculture. Alan Savory started holistic management, and he was putting a lot of research into this. He was from Zimbabwe, and at that stage, kind of 1960s to 1980s, he was looking at these massive elephant numbers in Kruger National Park, and couldn't understand why they'd done culling and yet the landscape wasn't getting any better. What regenerative agriculture is essentially looking at these principles and adjusting it to your context. So we've got to realize that in the Karoo, we would manage it very differently to Kruger National Park compared to Kenya, where there's migrations of wildebeest, compared to the UK.
So what we've just described, this learning from natural processes, taking it very seriously, the term regenerative farming, which I'm hearing a lot here, is the term to describe this approach to farming.
Yeah.
And that's what you're also deploying here. You're
Yes.
trying to
We're trying to do it here in a very brittle environment that doesn't look as it should even now. I mean, we think that there would have been at least 2 or 3 feet of topsoil above where we're standing. So these, I mean, this rock has fallen off the mountain, but these rocks here would not have been exposed 200 years ago.
Wow.
And so what we're trying to do is to stop the runoff, retain the water, retain the soil, and in, as I say, a highly brittle environment, using the stomach of the livestock here to conduct the processes that we need to get the microbes into the soil, which doesn't happen naturally easily here because we don't get enough rainfall and moisture.
You know, there's a lot of tedious virtue signalling that goes on in the green lobby, and I can understand why people have in many ways lost their patience with it. But I think that if we can accept the basic principle together, that the kind of stories that you told about the kinds of farming desolating the landscape, kinds of hunting, you know, market hunting as it's called in the United States, wiping out entire herds or even in some cases entire species. If we can look at this and just be honest about our poor stewardship in the past, that doesn't mean necessarily, because there's a sort of misanthropic trope where the solution to this is to herd human beings into urban pens, get us off the landscape, try and undo the whole history of human interaction with the landscape. But there's a third way here, which I think is what we've been exploring together and what we've been discussing now, which is actually bringing human beings back into a moral union with the landscape and with the animals with which they share the world, and taking a much more humble approach, sitting at the feet of nature and learning as students from it. If that's
and at the same time,
pompous way of putting it.
At the same time, they're being economically viable.
Yes.
And then encouraging a tourism industry that builds off the back of it. I mean, people want to see farming done properly, and they expect it to be done properly. And if they can see landscape, farming, wildlife thriving alongside each other, then it's a very powerful message.
Yeah, very.
never had an experience like that in my entire life. I've never had a hunting experience like that.
In what way?
Well, I mean,
surely you've been in the field following hounds for multiple hours. It's quite physical if you're following on foot.
Yeah, maybe 6.5 hours.
Right.
At most. But you're not scaling mountains and hanging off cliffs and you know, constantly worried that you're going to twist your ankle on a block of ironstone and
Not to scope.
or have baboons screaming at you from across the gorge. I mean, that moment, just being up on the cliff, hanging off those rocks, watching that small bachelor herd of kudu making their way through the gorge, and us assessing with the dassies leaping from rock to rock behind us and assessing how we were going to stalk these kudu.
And you never thought we were going to stalk it like we did, I suspect.
No, all the way around the gorge, yeah.
Yeah.
I think people need to understand how animals like this, like deer, like antelope, how they die if they don't come into contact with a predator.
Well, particularly in these parts where there's a very fine line between drought and plenty, and that bull at essentially 8 years old, maybe 9, maybe 10, but let's just say 8, he's lived almost his entire life through drought.
Right.
And he's never had it easy until maybe the last year or so. And his body will have taken a great deal of strain over these years. And so the reality is that we're now going into, I think, the depths of winter. The next few weeks are going to be pretty tough. Looking at his neck, looking at the stripes or lack of stripes on his hide, they've faded, he's old. Looking at his general awareness of what was going on around him, I think that this was his last year on the hill. I think he's almost certainly beyond breeding. And the law of averages state that of those 6 bulls that we were looking at very closely, he was the right one to take. Not because of his size, not because this is an ego trip.
No, sure.
Because, Sebastian, you're out there to play your part in nature. Do what the parasites would do very slowly. Do what illness or falling off a cliff would do. Do it with a bullet, efficiently. And you gave that your very best shot.
Well, I mean, this is what I say about deer in England. When people say it's terrible that you go and stalk deer in England, well, I explain to people that the only natural predator for deer in England
is gone.
Well, is us.
Well, exactly.
We're the natural predator.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We're the natural predator, and if we don't do it, then what happens is that deer die because they grind down their teeth. Then they start pulling up grass and leaves and things that they can't assimilate because they haven't broken down the fibers. And then eventually they lie down with these huge swollen stomachs of matter that they can't digest. Yeah. And they lie there and they essentially starve to death over many days while infection opens up in them and so on. It's the worst possible death. So the best thing that can ever happen to a deer is that it meets a predator. And frankly, the best kind of predator is one with a rifle who will kill it rather than kind of tearing it apart with teeth, will kill it in a hundredth of a second with a bullet to the neck.
And in so doing, we'll have one of the most original human experiences that one can have. You will connect in so doing with earliest of man, our earliest ancestors. And you will answer very serious questions about yourself. You'll normally have walked miles into those hills to do it. And then you're going to have to drag that animal off that hill, get it into a cold room. So it's all about discipline. It's not simply squeezing the trigger. That's the easy bit. The hard work starts getting up on the hill, finding the animals, outwitting the hinds, getting to the stag or whatever it is you're going to be taking off that day. The easy bit, in a way, is squeezing that trigger. Well, then the hard work starts again, the extraction. The other point about it what's everyone talk about at the moment? Sustainability. Well, what could be more sustainable than utilising wonderful meat?
Sure.
Rather than letting it rot on the hill. And unfortunately, 95% of, I imagine, venison just rots on the hill at the moment.
Right. I'm sure that's right in places, particularly in the UK. The actual experience that you alluded to of hunting, I quoted to you yesterday the philosopher Ortega. He said, "I do not hunt so that I might kill, but I kill so that I have hunted." That for him, the experience of the chase, the experience of the pursuit, to go out not as a mere observer of nature and the created order, but as a participant, as contiguous with it, as a part of it, as one of the predators who prowls among the predators of the world in search for his prey, but the only predator who can form a moral relation with his prey. Unlike the lion, who frankly, if the gazelle gets away injured, that's dinner lost, which might upset the lion.
Move on to the next.
But he's not really desperately worried about the welfare of the gazelle. A human, if he's a true hunter, it seems to me, will look for that animal, and want to dispatch it as quickly as possible for the good of that animal. Which is to form even if that animal can't form a moral relation with you, you can form a moral relation with it. And a good hunter does that with his quarry, really cares for it.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to what I referred to as my humiliation, because at the end of that day's hunting, here was that great big bull, and I mean, granted it was quite a distance away, but I took aim at it, and I entirely missed. I suppose my first thought was, as I saw it take off, was, oh my goodness, I've injured this creature, and now it might go for a mile or two, and it might be extremely difficult to find and locate. And when we got down and we assessed the ground and we found that there was absolutely no evidence, no blood, nothing, no evidence at all, it was a totally clean mess. I was positively elated. I was so happy that this animal had got away uninjured. But that evening I lay in bed and I couldn't sleep at all. I only got a couple of hours that night, and I lay there thinking, what the hell are you doing here? I allowed the pressure of having pursued something for so many hours, allowed the pressure of it
to allow you to squeeze the trigger.
Right, instead of saying, no, I'm not actually ready, and I just, if it gets away because I'm taking my time, then so be it, but I'm not going to just be negligent and stupid about this. But I allowed the pressure to get the better of me. And I lay there thinking, you're an academic and a writer and a trained philosopher. You're not. You think of yourself as an outdoorsman, but you're not really. You get out hunting a few times a year. You hunt with the local hounds. You deer stalk while you can. But actually, I'm a guy who lives in books and at a desk. I either read books or write books. And I just sort of thought, what you've done is you've decided that you would like to hunt more and more often. And now you're putting yourself in situations where you could really just be going around injuring animals and behaving in a stupid, immature way with a firearm, rather than being serious about the situation. And so I sort of tormented myself all night.
Well, I think it's healthy that you've reflected in that way and that you've put pressure on yourself. I think that's utterly commendable. There are plenty of people who would probably just go to sleep and move on, or pretend it hadn't happened. So I think it's a healthy thing that you've gone through that thought process. I also think that it would be a bloody great shame if it was left just to people like me to go out there, get involved, find the animals and shoot them and not tell anyone about it.
Professional hunters.
Yes. I think it's critical that people with a different background, different home life, come to these parts, test themselves in the most arduous of conditions, and then share their experiences with the wider audience. People like you who are actually able to convey these things in a different way.